And so Michael Cremo has an incredible amount of information to reveal on that. He is a wonderful man, a truly advanced spiritual soul, and is a gift to humanity. And it's our honor to introduce Michael Cremo. A round of applause, please.
So thank you all for rising early, coming here to hear something about this topic, forbidden archaeology. What I'm going to be talking about is evidence for extreme human antiquity, evidence that human beings like us have been on this planet for far longer than most scientists now think possible. Of course, if that's true, then that means we need new theories of human origin. So in my first talk, before the break, I'll be talking about forbidden archaeology, and after the break, I'll be presenting an alternative theory of human origins, which I call human devolution. So, I'm a researcher in human origins. I'm associated with the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which is a spiritual group that came out of India. I first came in contact with it in 1973, and I've been associated with it ever since. That means my thinking about these topics is influenced by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And I've also studied other spiritual texts as well, but I'm most influenced by the spiritual texts from ancient India. And I've presented my ideas at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world. Not all scientists are closed-minded. Some are willing to listen, actually. So I've been able to speak about these ideas at places like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Science in Moscow, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. But not everybody likes what I have to say. Sometimes the discussions get a little heated with some of the more orthodox members of the scientific community. And I don't speak just at big scientific institutions and universities. I speak in a lot of different venues. This is an eco camp in Alto Paraíso, Brazil. I've done several lecture tours there. So I have lots of different audiences for my work. Some of them are pretty straight-laced academics, and others are more on the spiritual side, as many of you are. So the question I'm dealing with this morning is, how old is the human species? Today, the most common answer to that question comes from the modern followers of Charles Darwin. And some of my friends tell me, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin, and you've had to take birth again to correct your mistake. That's why you have to travel all over the world giving thousands of these lectures. Trying to make, I think James had mentioned something like that yesterday in his talk about some of the karmic payback that sometimes happens. So I don't know if that's true, but I mean, I laughed the first time somebody told me that too, but now I'm starting to wonder about it. So according to the standard Darwinian theories, the first humans like us appeared about 150,000 years ago on this planet. And before that, they would say there were no human beings like us. There were only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. But the ancient Sanskrit writings of India and many other ancient wisdom traditions tell us that humans have always existed on Earth. We've been here since the very beginning. As a matter of fact, the Earth was manifested for specific reasons having to do with our human consciousness. So, if that's true, if humans have been here since the very beginning of life on Earth, going back millions and millions of years, then we can make a prediction. There should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 150,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So that's the prediction I made back in 1984 when I first started doing this research. And the way I conducted my research, my methodology was to look at all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin to the present, not just what we see in the textbooks, but all archaeological reports. So I had a couple of findings. My first finding is not so surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature textbooks, for example. I divided the scientific literature into two parts. The primary scientific literature, by which I mean the original reports by scientists published in professional scientific journals. And then there is the secondary scientific literature, which is based on the primary literature. And by secondary literature, I mean things like textbooks, survey studies, and things of that sort. So my first finding was, if you look at the textbooks today, you aren't going to see any of this archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. You're only going to see the reports of evidence that go along with the current dominant theories that humans like us appeared fairly recently on this planet. Now my second finding is a little more interesting. There are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. And again, as I said, by primary scientific literature, I mean the original reports by archaeologists, anthropologists, paleontologists, published in the professional scientific literature. So I collected all those reports in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, with my co-author, Richard Thompson. And one way you can judge the impact of a book is, does it get reviewed in the professional scientific literature? And this book caused quite a stir within the scientific world. It was reviewed in most of the professional scientific journals that deal with human origins. And of course, it's a very controversial book, so as you might expect, some of the reviews were very negative and dismissive, but some were actually quite positive, which shows there are some academics who do have some open minds. For example, David Oldroyd, a historian of science, a noted historian of science, wrote in Social Studies of Science. He asked a question: so has Forbidden Archaeology made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? That's the science of human origins. He said, our answer is a guarded yes, for two reasons. First, much of the historical material has not been scrutinized in such detail before. He's a professional historian of science, specializing in the history of archaeology. And he said, as a professional historian of science, he'd seen no one who had gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before. And second, he said, the book raises a central problematic regarding the lack of certainty in scientific truth claims. Let me translate that for you. You know, academics like to speak in this kind of language. But what he means is that scientists will say that a certain theory is absolutely true. It's absolutely certain in its truth value. They say, for example, the Darwinian theory of human evolution is absolutely true. So what he's saying is, we're raising some questions about that. Maybe they shouldn't be saying it's absolutely true. Maybe they should just say, well, this is a theory we're considering, and maybe it's wrong, and maybe something else could be right. So some academics did like what we did with the book Forbidden Archaeology. Of course, that book is 900 pages long, and some people call it Forbidding Archaeology. It's just too big to pick up. You can try, there's a couple of copies out there, you can try lifting one yourself and see what I mean. So we brought out the book in a shorter edition called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is about 1/3 of the length of Forbidden Archaeology. You call it Forbidden Archaeology Light. So after the book came out, then I started representing it at scientific conferences. And I felt like I was jumping out of an airplane with no parachute. The first conference that I presented this work at was in 1994. It was a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. The World Archaeological Congress is the world's largest international organization of archaeologists, and it meets every 4 years in a different city in a different country. So that year, they held their meeting in India, and I thought, well, this would be the perfect place for me to present some ideas about human antiquity based on the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. So I went there, and I presented a paper called Puranic Time in the Archaeological Record. The Puranas are the historical writings of ancient India. They are the books that tell about human civilizations that have existed on Earth for millions and millions of years. So the Vedic or Puranic concept of time is cyclical. So I explained all that, and I gave the archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. And that paper was later selected for publishing in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings. Sometimes people ask, some of us in the alternative history field, has your work been peer-reviewed? And in my case, the answer is yes. You know, they say, has your work been published in official scientific publications? And for me, the answer is yes, sometimes. So, if there is all of this archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity in the scientific literature, my question is, why is this evidence not in the textbooks? Why is it not in the secondary literature? I propose it's because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call that little blue box there the knowledge filter. And what it represents is the fixed ideas that many scientists now have about this question of human origins. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this knowledge filter very easily, which means students will read about it in the textbooks, people will see these things in the local museum. But if we've got evidence that radically contradicts the fixed ideas, we don't hear very much about it. Students aren't going to read about it in their textbooks. People are not going to see these things in the local museum when they walk through it. Now I'm going to give some examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. Some of it's going to be from the more recent history of archaeology. Some of it's going to be from the older history of archaeology. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's a geologist I know personally. When she was a recent PhD graduate, she was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico called Huayatlaco. It's near the town of Puebla in central Mexico. There, archaeologists discovered human artifacts. Here's the excavation at Huayatlaco. It was a very professional excavation. The stone tools and weapons were photographed in the layers of rock in which they were found. And of course, the archaeologists wanted to know how old these things were. So they called a team of geologists to the site, because the geologists can tell them how old things are. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. I'll mention 2 of them. In the same layers with the stone tools, animal bones with butchering marks on them were found. The geologists used the uranium series method to date those bones. They got ages up to 245,000 years. Above the layer with stone tools was a layer of volcanic ash. The geologists used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. So the geologists concluded the site must be at least 250,000 years old. But the archaeologists said that's impossible. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago. They hadn't evolved yet. They believe they first evolved 150,000 years ago. So the archaeologists refused to publish the age or the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. So that shocked Virginia Steen McIntyre. She was just thinking, well, we're just doing our science, and this is the results we're getting. Why aren't they accepting it? So she and her colleagues decided to independently publish the age or the site in a scientific journal called Quaternary Research. But when they did that, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world because they had dared publish something that contradicted the Darwinian theory of human evolution. And Virginia Steen McIntyre in particular suffered from this. Up to this point, she had been a rising star in her profession. But when she did this, suddenly she found that all of her opportunities for advancement in her career of geology were shut off. She lost a teaching position that she held at a university. She was labeled a troublemaker, a maverick, a publicity seeker. It was really amazing. She wrote in a letter to the journal that published her report, not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Geological has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period. Now we're going to go back to the earlier history of archaeology. This is Jacques Boucher-de-Pere, one of the founders of modern archaeology. He lived in France in the 19th century. He made an interesting discovery there. He found an anatomically modern human jaw at a place called Oulan-Quignon near Abbeville in France. And he found it in the bottom layer there of his excavation, along with many stone tools and weapons. And according to modern geologists, that bottom layer of the excavation is about 430,000 years old. So it was a very controversial discovery, even in the 19th century. Many scientists did not believe that humans like us existed so far in the past. So some of them proposed an explanation. They said, here's what obviously must have happened. Somebody must have gone to a Roman cemetery and gotten a human jaw, maybe 2,000 years old. And then they must have gone to the excavation and planted it there for Boucher-de-Pere to find. And actually, you're laughing, but that's the story that you see in the textbooks today. Now, what we don't see in the textbooks is that after these hoax accusations were leveled at him, Jacques Boucher-de-Pere went back and made additional excavations in the same locations. And in these new excavations, he found 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth in the same layers. So you're not going to see that mentioned in the textbooks today, but that information is there in the primary scientific literature, the original reports. So I presented a paper about this discovery at a meeting of the 20th International Congress for the History of Science. and that paper was published in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings. So again, the reason I'm mentioning that is sometimes the critics of people like myself will say, well, you may have all these ideas, but have they been peer-reviewed? Have they been published in the professional literature? So yes, in this case, the answer to those questions is yes. Now, in the beginning of the 20th century, an interesting discovery was made at Buenos Aires. An anatomically modern human skull was found there. It was found in an excavation that went down about 15 meters, about 45 feet. At that level, the excavators broke through a thick layer of limestone rock that was locally called Tosca. And below that level, they found the human skull in the pre-Ensenada formation, which according to modern geologists is over 1.5 million years old. So these discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Florentino Amadino, who was a prominent South American scientist, a paleontologist. And I reported on this discovery at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that took place in South Africa in 1999. Now, a lot of people have heard about Olduvai Gorge in Africa. It's a place where many discoveries have been made, but most people aren't aware of the first discovery that was made there. It was made in 1913 by a German scientist named Hans Reck. He found a complete anatomically modern human skeleton there. He found it in upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge. And according to modern geologists, upper bed 2 is over 1.15 million years old. So it was a very controversial discovery. There have been decades of debate about this discovery. And many people thought the debate was settled in about 1970. There was a German scientist named Rainer Proch who said he had got a radiocarbon date, a carbon-14 date, on a fragment of bone from the skeleton, and it gave an age of less than 10,000 years. So most scientists thought, okay, this question has now been settled. It's really not a very old skeleton. It's only a few thousand years old. But I have some problems with that conclusion. First of all, the skeleton was lost during World War II. It was in a museum in Germany, and that museum was bombed. So the piece of bone that Proch dated was from some box he found in some other museum, and he just said, I think it's a fragment of bone from the original skeleton. I'm not so sure of that. So I'm not even so sure that the fragment of bone that he dated was from the actual wrecked skeleton. A second thing is, Rainer Proch was forced to resign from his position at a university in Germany after an academic committee found him guilty of falsifying dozens of radiocarbon dates during his long career there. So I don't think his radiocarbon date on a fragment of bone that's probably not even from the original skeleton really resolves the debate about Reck's skeleton, which was found in layers of rock over 1 million years old. In the 19th century, Dr. Robert H. Collier reported about a fossil human jaw, an anatomically modern human jaw that was found 16 feet deep in the Red Crag Formation at a place called Foxhall in England, which is located on the east coast of England near the town of Ipswich. The Red Crag Formation, according to modern geologists, is between 2 and 3 million years old, and this human jaw was found 16 feet deep in that formation. So we've got evidence that humans were existing 2 or 3 million years ago. In 1979, Mary Leakey announced the discovery of footprints at a place called Lake Toli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. Now, in her original report, Mary Leakey said the footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. Other scientists also agreed. Paleontologist Tim White said, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Now, the interesting thing is that these footprints are found in layers of rock 3,700,000 years old. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that humans like us existed almost 4 million years ago. You know, they're supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution. According to them, humans like us first appeared 150,000 years ago. So how did they explain those footprints? Well, they said there must have existed some kind of ape man who had feet exactly like modern human feet. Now, that's an interesting proposal, but there's no physical evidence to support it. We have the skeletons of the ape men who existed at that time. They're called Australopithecus. And the foot of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It's like that of a chimpanzee. It has very long toes, sort of like human fingers. It has a big first toe that can go out to the side like a human thumb. If you look at your feet, I don't think you can do that. Maybe some of you, but not very many, if any. So actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot like a modern human foot is a human being like ourselves. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I think she found evidence that human beings like us were existing almost 4 million years ago. And I think that's the most rational, logical conclusion. Now, maybe someday in the future, maybe some scientists might find the skeleton of some ape man that has a foot exactly like a modern human foot, but up to this point in time, no one has found any such thing. Now, somebody might say, okay, footprints are one kind of evidence. It would be better if you had human skeletons 4 million years old. And such things do exist. In the late 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found several human skeletons at a place called Castanedolo in northern Italy. He found them in layers of rock 4 million years old. I went to that village of Castanedolo. I met this gentleman there, and he gave me a copy of a very rare geological report about this discovery. And from the information in the report, we were able to locate the exact place where the original excavation was made. It should be possible to do more research there. Now, when some scientists hear that a human skeleton has been found in layers of rock 4 million years old, they say, something's got to be wrong here. Here's what probably happened. They say, somebody probably died about 4,000 years ago on the surface there. Then his friends dug a grave and put the body down there, and that's why you think you found a human skeleton 4 million years old. Now, things like this can happen. They do happen. Technically, it's called intrusive burial. But in this case, Dr. Ragazzoni was a professional geologist. He was very much aware of this problem. And he said, okay, if it had been a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton should have been disturbed, as we see here. But he said in his original report that he looked very carefully when he was taking the skeleton out of the ground, and he could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed, which means the skeleton really was as old as the layers of rock in which it was found, in this case, 4 million years. Now we're going to jump back even further in time. This is Carlos Ribeiro. He was the chief government geologist of Portugal in the latter part of the 19th century. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal in layers of rock 20 million years old. He displayed these artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels showing an age of 20 million years. But if you go to the museum today, you will not see those artifacts displayed in those cases anymore. Today, they're kept locked away in some of the cabinets there. But I got permission from the director of the museum to open up those cabinets, and I was able to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old human artifacts from Portugal. These are some of them. I also studied Dr. Ribeiro's original maps and field notes, and then I went into the countryside of Portugal and I relocated some of the places where he made his discoveries. This is the quarry at Borgonheira, where he found human artifacts in layers of rock 20 million years old, including this one. It's a flint implement, a pointed flint implement. Now it's interesting what happened. When Ribeiro was alive, he displayed these artifacts in the museum in Lisbon with labels showing an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues in the museum did something interesting. They left the objects on display, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them far younger ages. This is the new label they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. The second line, it gives the age. It says Paleolitico Superior, and that means upper Paleolithic period. According to archaeologists, that period goes back about 20,000 years. So they thought 20 million years, that's impossible. That can't possibly be true. 20,000 years, that sounds about right. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. And then the next generation of officials in the museum put the entire collection away, new labels and all. And I'm the first researcher to see them in over 50 years. I presented a paper about these discoveries at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists that took place in Lisbon in the year 2000. I thought it would be a good place to talk about these things. And recently that paper has been published in a leading journal of archaeology, the Journal of Iberian Archaeology. Well, that's the archaeology of Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. So again, people ask, has your work been published in scientific publications? Has it been peer-reviewed? The answer is yes. Now, a case that I've always found extremely fascinating is the California gold mine discoveries. In 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners went there to get the gold, to places like Table Mountain near Sonora in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And to get the gold, they were digging tunnels into the sides of this mountain. And deep inside the tunnels, in the solid rock, the miners were finding human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles. And what makes these things so interesting to me is that they were found in layers of solid rock that belonged to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which you can see towards the bottom of that chart, which means these human bones and human artifacts are up to 50 million years old. Now, these discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. Whitney. He was the chief government geologist of California. Mount Whitney was named after him. And his report was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. But we do not see these things mentioned in the textbooks today because of the process of knowledge filtration. This is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case, the anthropologist William Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution. And he wrote in one of his reports, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he would not have published that report. In other words, if the facts didn't go along with the theory, they should simply have been forgotten. And basically, that's what happened. Now, a few years ago, I was a consultant for a documentary called The Mysterious Origins of Man that was shown on NBC. The producer of the show, a man named Bill Cote, had read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and he wanted to include some cases from the book in this documentary. So I told him he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of this museum. So he went there, but the museum official said, well, you can't see them. I mean, what to speak of film them. So we were able to find some photographs of the artifacts that Dr. Whitney had taken in the 19th century. So we did have some images to use in that documentary, The Mysterious Origins of Man, in which I appear. So it was interesting what happened when scientists who support the current theories learned that NBC was going to show this documentary on a Sunday evening when many innocent children would be up and watching TV with their parents. They went ballistic. They tried to stop NBC from showing the program. They weren't successful. Actually, NBC showed it several times. And this just infuriated these scientists. They were just absolutely outraged. They've got complete control over the education system. Some of the children are in school. They've got complete control over their minds. But they were shocked that a major network would show them something that contradicted what they were being taught at school. So they went, this group of scientists went to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency of the government that regulates the TV broadcasting industry. And they tried to get the FCC to investigate NBC, to censure NBC. They wanted the government to force NBC to broadcast primetime apologies for having shown the program. Dear American people, we're so sorry that we did this. And they also wanted the government to fine NBC millions of dollars for having shown this program. I'm happy to say the government didn't do any of that, but I thought it was interesting that there were these organized attempts by members of the scientific community to control the information that people get from the media. Now later, I went back to the museum myself. I'm a member of the World Archaeological Congress, and I made a proposal to the World Archaeological Congress to give a report about these discoveries at their next big conference. And that proposal was accepted in writing. So I was able to go back to the museum officials and say, okay, I want to see these things. And they decided they would let me personally see them. Now, they're not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum. But they are still there. And, I mean, sometimes, you know, we think that these stories of strange things in museum collections that people just don't get to see is just Hollywood fantasy, you know, from Indiana Jones movies and things like that. But it really is a fact. There are things in the collections of the world museums that are not put on display and which radically contradict the current theories of human origins. So I also carefully studied Dr. Whitney's original maps and field notes. And I went to the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is Table Mountain as it looks today, and we were able to find some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these things were originally discovered, and it should be possible to do more research there. So this is the report that I presented about the California gold mine discoveries at the meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that took place in Washington, D.C. in the year 2003. So the reason I'm mentioning these things is because there are some scientists who are willing to listen to new ideas and information that may contradict their current theories. And they are the ones who are inviting me to speak at these conferences. Now, they're not the majority by any means, but there are some there. Now, how far back in time can we go with evidence like this? In the year 1862, a scientific journal called The Geologist published an interesting report. An anatomically modern human skeleton was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County in the state of Illinois. According to the report, directly above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that was unbroken, which kind of rules out the intrusive burial idea. And according to modern geologists of the state of Illinois, the layer of rock below the slate rock there, the layer of rock in which the skeleton was found, is over 300 million years old. Now, this interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 15 feet deep in solid rock in Dorchester, which is in the Boston area. And this metal vase had beautifully inlaid silver patterns on it. It was absolutely beautiful. Now, according to modern geologists of the United States Geological Survey, the layer of rock in which this object was found is called the Roxbury conglomerate. And it's a very well-studied formation in that area. And they say it's over 600 million years old. Now, the oldest objects that I found in my research come from South Africa. Miners there have found many of these round metallic objects at a place called Ottosdal in the western Transvaal region of South Africa. These objects are 1 or 2 inches in diameter. The most interesting feature is the parallel grooves that go around the center of each object. Now, these objects were shown in that NBC documentary, The Mysterious Origins of Man. But before NBC agreed to allow them to be shown in the documentary, they said, you have to give them to an independent company of metallurgists for examination. So that was done. Bill Cote, the producer, arranged for an independent company of metallurgists to examine these objects. And they found they're made of hematite, which is a semi-precious stone. It's used in jewelry. And they also concluded that these things could not have formed naturally in the layers of the earth, particularly the grooves going around the center of each object. So that means they had to have been made by someone with human-like intelligence. But these things are found solidly embedded in layers of rock over 2 billion, not million, 2 billion years old, which goes right back to the very beginnings of life on Earth. They're fascinating objects. this is a photograph that's published in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And after that book came out, a television producer in the Netherlands, in Holland, saw it, and he wrote to us. And he said, I want to go to the museum where this thing is and film it. So that these things are, this object, this particular object, was being kept in the Museum of Natural History in Klerksdorp, South Africa. And we put him in touch with a man named Ralph Borks, who was the director of that museum. And he reported back to us this object had been stolen from the museum by a person he characterized as a white witch. So I hope it's being put to some good use somewhere. So actually I could keep you here from now until Christmas, going through one case after another, because there are hundreds of these cases in the scientific literature, but I'm not going to do that. But I'll just wrap up with a couple of points here. The first point is this evidence clearly contradicts the current theories of human origins, and this evidence is consistent with the accounts of extreme human antiquity that we find in many of the ancient wisdom traditions. So that's very important to understand. Now, I'm going to end by giving an example of what happens when I present this kind of evidence in universities around the world. My books are now published in about 20 different languages. One of the languages is Russian. This is the Russian edition of Hidden History of the Human Race. So I've spoken at universities all over Russia, from one end of the country to the other. And usually things go fine, but in some cases there have been some problems. This is the Tumen State University in Russia. Some professors there wanted to hear me speak, so they arranged for me to give a lecture. But the day before the lecture, the president of the university canceled the lecture because of pressure from scientists in the university who were supporters of the current theories. They didn't want me to speak there. First of all, because I was contradicting the Darwinian theory of evolution, and second of all, because I was doing it from some kind of spiritual perspective. So the professors who invited me tried to get the president of the university to change his mind, but he wouldn't. The pressure from the other side was just too great. So the professors who invited me then went to the local branch of the Russian Academy of Science. And they spoke to the director there. And he said, okay, Michael Cremo can speak here, and nobody will put any pressure on me to cancel his lecture. So they had buses bring students and professors from the university to the Russian Academy of Science building. And the professors who invited me said, more people came than would have come if the lecture had been held at the university, because everybody was talking, what is this guy going to say? You know, that's so dangerous that the president canceled his lecture. So then after the lecture, I had a meeting with the Russian Academy of Science director and some of the scientists who liked what I had to say. And then the next year, I went back to the same university, and I spoke in the biology department there, no problem. I guess they learned their lesson. Now, this sort of thing doesn't just happen in Russia. Earlier this year, I did a lecture tour of universities in the Midwestern United States. I spoke at Penn State, I spoke at Northwestern University in Chicago, the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, a lot of other universities. At the University of Indiana in Bloomington, a lecture was scheduled. The same sort of thing happened. When supporters of the current theories at the university found the lecture had been scheduled, they put pressure on the university administration to cancel the lecture. So actually, if I didn't get a few lectures each year canceled, I'd have to stop calling myself the forbidden archaeologist. So if you're interested in pursuing these ideas a little bit further, You can see these books. There's copies in the book room. And after the break, I'm going to be speaking about an alternative theory of human origins. Because what you've heard here, it contradicts the current theory. So then the question is, well, where do you think human beings came from? And that's what I'll be talking about after the break. Thank you.
What an amazing man and an amazing